The concrete fortress stretched along Europe's coast like a scar. For 3 years it had grown stronger. Steel and stone rose from every cliff. Machine gun nests sprouted from sand dunes. Artillery pieces pointed their black muzzles toward the gray Channel waters. Hitler had promised the world this wall would never break. No enemy would cross these beaches. No invasion fleet would pierce this armor of concrete and wire. The Atlantic Wall would stand forever. But promises made of concrete crumble faster than those made of steel and blood. On a misty morning in June 1944, the greatest gamble in military history began. Out of the fog came ships. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands upon thousands of vessels moving like a steel tide toward the French coast. The wall that was meant to be unbreakable faced its first real test. In less than one day, everything would change. The fate of Europe hung in the balance between Hitler's concrete dreams and Allied determination. What secret weakness doomed the Atlantic Wall before the first shot was fired? The answer lay not in the concrete itself, but in the minds of those who built it. The gray waters of the English Channel had been empty for so long. German sentries grew used to staring at nothing. Waves rolled endlessly against the shore. Seabirds cried above empty beaches. The rhythm of tide and time became their world. Behind thick concrete walls, soldiers cleaned their weapons again and again. They wrote letters home. They played cards by lamplight in damp bunkers. Some had been watching these waters for 2 years, others for 3. The waiting had become a way of life. Every dawn brought the same empty horizon. Every sunset painted the same peaceful waters. Many began to believe the invasion would never come. Then June 6th arrived with its deadly surprise. Darkness still covered the Channel when the first shadows appeared. At first they looked like tricks of the morning mist, strange shapes moving on the water. Then more shapes. Then more. The sea itself seemed to be moving toward France. What emerged from that gray dawn was beyond imagination. 5,000 ships spread across the horizon. Landing craft by the hundreds. Destroyers cutting white wakes through dark water. Battleships with guns bigger than anything on the wall itself. It was not just a fleet. It was an ocean made of steel and purpose. The largest armada in human history was bearing down on Hitler's fortress Europe. Inside German bunkers, alarm bells began to ring. Radio operators frantically called headquarters. Artillery crews rushed to their guns. Searchlights swept desperate beams through the fading darkness. Some defenders stood frozen. The scale was too vast to comprehend. This was not the small raid they had trained to repel. This was something that rewrote the rules of war itself. The Atlantic Wall was about to face its reckoning. And many of its defenders already sensed the truth. The concrete that surrounded them felt less like protection and more like a tomb. Then came the thunder. Allied warships opened fire with guns that shook the earth. The sky lit up with orange flashes. Shells screamed overhead like banshees. The very air seemed to tear apart. The fortress that Hitler claimed would last 1,000 years was about to discover how long concrete could stand against the fury of free nations. The story began 3 years earlier in the winter of 1941. Snow fell across occupied Europe. Hitler's armies had swept eastward into Russia. The campaign was supposed to end in months. Instead, it dragged into a nightmare of winter warfare and endless casualties. Behind the Führer's confident broadcasts lay a growing fear. Germany now fought on multiple fronts. The Soviet Union absorbed division after division. Britain remained unbroken across the Channel. America had entered the war with its vast industrial might. Hitler understood the mathematics of strategy. Somewhere, someday, the Allies would attempt to return to continental Europe. They would come from across the water. They would strike at the weakest point they could find, unless that weak point no longer existed. The idea consumed him during the long winter nights of 1942. Every mile of coastline from Norway to Spain must become a fortress. Concrete bunkers would rise from the cliffs. Artillery would command every beach. Machine guns would sweep every landing zone. No enemy force would ever set foot on European soil again. He called his vision the Atlantic Wall. The name itself carried power. Not the Atlantic Line or the Atlantic Defense. A wall. Solid. Permanent. Unbreakable. To the German people, weary of news about defeats in Russia, the Atlantic Wall became a symbol of hope. Propaganda films showed massive bunkers being carved from solid rock. Giant guns pointed menacingly toward England. Endless rows of steel obstacles glinted in the sun. The message was clear. Fortress Europe was impregnable. But military reality proved more complex than propaganda promises. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt commanded German forces in Western Europe. He was an old soldier who understood the impossible mathematics of the Atlantic Wall. Over 2,000 miles of coastline, thousands of potential landing sites. Never enough troops to defend them all strongly. Rundstedt favored keeping armored reserves inland. When the invasion came, mobile forces could rush to the threatened sector. Concentrated firepower would smash the enemy back into the sea. Erwin Rommel disagreed completely. The Desert Fox had faced Allied air power in North Africa. He knew what happened to tank columns caught in the open. Allied fighters would tear them apart before they reached the battlefield. To Rommel, the only chance was to stop the invasion at the water's edge. Pack every bunker with guns. Fill every field with obstacles. Make the beaches themselves into killing grounds. The debate raged through the high command. Two brilliant generals. Two completely different strategies. Neither able to convince the other. Hitler made the worst possible decision. He chose both strategies and neither. Some panzer divisions would remain in reserve under his personal control. Others would be scattered along the coast under Rommel's direction. When the critical moment came, German forces would have neither the concentrated mobile reserve Rundstedt wanted nor the beach fortifications Rommel demanded. Across the Channel, Allied planners studied their enemy's growing fortress. Winston Churchill had long believed that victory required a direct assault on Hitler's Europe. American military leaders agreed. The question was when and where. The obvious target was the Pas de Calais, the narrowest part of the Channel, the shortest route to Germany. But its very obviousness made it dangerous. Any landing there would face the strongest section of the Atlantic Wall. Allied eyes began to turn toward Normandy, less heavily defended, less expected, more suitable for the massive logistics operation an invasion would require. By 1943, two mighty forces were preparing for collision. Hitler's concrete fortress grew stronger every month. The Allied invasion plan grew more detailed every week. Neither side could see the full picture. Hitler believed his wall would hold back any assault. The Allies gambled everything on breaking through in a single day. The stage was set for one of history's greatest military confrontations. Construction of the Atlantic Wall began in earnest after the Dieppe raid of August 1942. Canadian forces had attempted to storm the heavily defended port. The attack became a slaughter. Of the 6,000 men who landed, fewer than half returned to England. The lesson was clear to Hitler. Coastal fortifications worked. They could turn beaches into graveyards. If Dieppe, with its limited defenses, could destroy an entire raid, imagine what a properly fortified coastline could accomplish. Hitler issued his orders with the confidence of a man who had conquered most of Europe. The western coast would become the greatest fortress in history. No effort would be spared. No expense would be too great. Organization taut, the Reich's massive construction arm swung into action. 500,000 workers were mobilized. German engineers, French laborers conscripted at gunpoint, prisoners of war from a dozen nations. All were driven by the demands of concrete and steel. The scale was breathtaking. Quarries blasted stone around the clock. Factories poured steel reinforcement bars by the thousands of tons. Railway lines carried cement and supplies to every section of the coast. Entire forests were cut down to provide wooden forms for concrete. Mountains of gravel were hauled to mixing sites. The landscape itself was being transformed into a weapon of war. By 1944, over 15,000 separate fortifications dotted the Atlantic coast. Massive gun casemates housed artillery pieces capable of sinking battleships. Underground tunnels connected firing positions to ammunition storage. Command bunkers buried deep in cliff faces coordinated defensive fire. At key ports like Cherbourg and Le Havre, the fortifications rivaled anything built in human history. Concrete walls 30 feet thick shrugged off bombing attacks. Gun turrets turned on massive steel bearings to track targets across the water. Underground facilities could house entire garrisons for months. Rommel demanded even more obstacles. Thousands of wooden stakes were driven into tidal flats. Each stake was topped with mines that would destroy landing craft before they reached the sand. Steel tripods, called Czech hedgehogs, were welded together and planted across every possible landing beach. Inland from the coast, open fields were filled with tall poles connected by wires. Rommel's asparagus was designed to shred gliders, attempting to land troops behind the beaches. Every road was blocked. Every bridge was prepared for demolition. To German propaganda, the Atlantic Wall became a source of national pride. Newsreels showed smiling workers building bunkers. Officers pointed confidently at maps showing defensive positions. The Führer himself visited construction sites and proclaimed the fortress impregnable. The reality was more complex. Concrete was rushed. Quality control was poor. In many sectors, bunkers were built without proper camouflage. Artillery pieces were outdated weapons transferred from other fronts. Some positions faced the wrong direction entirely. Machine gun nests were sited to cover areas where no enemy could possibly land. Supply routes to bunkers were easily cut by bombing or sabotage. Rommel himself grew increasingly worried as he toured the defenses. Empty stretches of coast remained lightly defended. Gun crews were poorly trained on their weapons. Ammunition supplies were inadequate for a sustained battle. His reports painted a disturbing picture. The Atlantic Wall looked impressive from a distance. Up close, it resembled a sieve. Still, to the young soldiers assigned to defend it, the wall represented safety and strength. In Normandy, German infantry lived in concrete bunkers overlooking beaches covered with obstacles. They slept on wooden planks in rooms that dripped with moisture from the sea air. Each morning, they cleaned their weapons and stared through narrow firing slits at empty beaches. Each evening, they wrote letters home describing the quiet life of fortress guards. Some took pride in their thick concrete walls. Others felt trapped inside what seemed more like prisons than defensive positions. For Hitler, the Atlantic Wall was more than military necessity. It was a statement of defiance to the Allied powers. Europe was sealed. The continent belonged to Germany. Any attempt at invasion would meet with disaster. He believed that massive fortification could substitute for strategic flexibility. While his generals argued for mobile defense, he insisted on fixed positions. Each new bunker represented another stone in his wall of absolute security. Yet across the Channel, Allied intelligence was already dissecting every aspect of the Atlantic Wall. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed every bunker and gun position. French resistance fighters smuggled out detailed plans and measurements. British commandos landed on beaches at night to collect sand samples and test obstacles. What Hitler saw as an impregnable shield, Allied planners studied as a complex puzzle. Every piece of concrete was catalogued and analyzed. Every weakness was identified and exploited. The Atlantic Wall rose higher each month through 1943 and into 1944, but so did Allied knowledge, technology, and determination. The fortress that was supposed to guarantee German security was becoming the target for the greatest military operation in history. Daily life inside the Atlantic Wall had settled into a rhythm of tedium, punctuated by brief moments of alarm. German soldiers assigned to bunker duty lived in a world of damp concrete, rusting steel, and endless waiting. Morning began with weapon inspection and position checks. Machine gunners cleaned their barrels for the 100th time. Artillery crews verified range cards and ammunition supplies. Radio operators tested communications with headquarters. Then came the long hours of watching. Eyes strained against the gray horizon, searching for shapes that never appeared. The English Channel stretched empty to the limits of vision. Only fishing boats and seabirds disturbed the peaceful waters. Many defenders had been stationed in the same bunkers for months or even years. They knew every crack in the concrete walls. They had memorized the view from each firing port. The war had become a matter of routine maintenance rather than active combat. Letters home spoke more of boredom than danger. Soldiers complained about damp bedding and poor food rather than enemy action. Some mocked the endless construction as Hitler's sandcastles. Others wondered if the invasion everyone talked about would ever actually come. But Rommel was far from complacent. The Desert Fox traveled constantly along the Atlantic coast, inspecting defenses with the sharp eye of a veteran commander. He had felt Allied firepower in North Africa. He understood what modern warfare could do to static positions. At every stop, Rommel demanded improvements. More mines in the tidal zone. Additional obstacles on the beaches, better camouflage for gun positions, stronger communication systems between bunkers. He spoke urgently to his officers about the coming battle. The first 24 hours of invasion will be decisive. If we can hold the enemy on the beaches for one day, we can destroy them completely. But if they establish a foothold, our situation becomes desperate. Rommel knew that Allied air power would dominate any daylight movement. Tank columns caught on French roads would be torn apart by fighter bombers. The only chance was to smash the invasion at the moment of landing, before enemy forces could organize and call in air support. His sense of urgency was not shared by all German commanders. Many still believed the Atlantic Wall was strong enough to handle any assault. The concrete looked solid. The guns were powerful. The obstacles were formidable. What they could not see was the storm gathering across the Channel. In dozens of English ports and harbors, the greatest invasion fleet in history was taking shape. Landing ships loaded with tanks and artillery. Transport vessels packed with infantry. Warships ranging from destroyers to battleships, all preparing for the assault on Fortress Europe. British shipyards worked around the clock building specialized equipment. Amphibious tanks that could swim through surf. Engineering vehicles that carried their own bridges. Flame-throwing tanks designed to clear bunkers. mine-clearing tanks that whipped chains to detonate explosives. They called them Hobart's Funnies, after the general who developed them. The machines looked strange, almost comical, but they would prove essential in breaking through the Atlantic Wall's defenses. American factories produced landing craft by the thousands. Prefabricated harbors were constructed in sections, ready to be towed across the channel and assembled off the invasion beaches. Even pipelines were prepared to pump fuel under the water from England to France. The scale of preparation dwarfed anything attempted in military history. Over 2 million men were involved in planning and executing the invasion. Entire divisions practiced landings on British beaches. Officers studied detailed models of German positions built from reconnaissance photographs. At the same time, an elaborate deception campaign was underway. Fictional armies were created on paper and in German mines. Inflatable tanks sat in British fields, photographed by German spy planes. False radio traffic suggested that the main invasion would target the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. The deception worked perfectly. German intelligence became convinced that Normandy would be a diversion, and the real attack would come at Calais. Precious reserves remained positioned to defend the wrong beaches. As spring turned toward summer in 1944, both sides felt the growing tension. German defenders cleaned their weapons more frequently and scanned the horizon more carefully. Allied soldiers attended final briefings and wrote last letters home. The weather became crucial. Invasion required specific conditions. Low tide to expose German obstacles. Dawn light for naval bombardment. Calm seas for landing craft. A narrow window of opportunity was approaching in early June. On both sides of the channel, men sensed that the waiting was almost over. The Atlantic Wall stood ready for its greatest test. The Allied invasion force prepared for the gamble that would decide the fate of Europe. Neither side could predict how quickly and decisively the battle would be resolved. The night of June 5, 1944, brought weather that made commanders on both sides nervous. Storm clouds swept across the English Channel. Rain lashed the water in driving sheets. Waves tossed landing craft like toys. General Eisenhower faced the most difficult decision of his career: launch the invasion in dangerous weather or postpone for weeks until conditions improved. Delay meant losing the element of surprise, but attacking in a storm could end in disaster. Weather forecasters detected a brief break in the storms. A narrow window of calmer conditions would arrive just after midnight on June 6th. It was not ideal, but it might be enough. Eisenhower sat silent for long minutes, weighing the fate of millions. Finally, he looked up at his assembled commanders and spoke simply. "Okay, we'll go." The greatest armada in human history began to move through the darkness. Paratroopers boarded transport planes, their faces blackened with charcoal for night operations. Equipment bags contained ammunition, explosives, and medical supplies for battles behind enemy lines. Many would be scattered far from their drop zones. Some would never reach the ground alive. Soldiers filed into landing craft already tossing in rough seas. Seasickness struck before they left harbor. Men who had trained for months found themselves too sick to care about the battle ahead. They clutched helmets and tried not to think about the morning. Tank crews made final checks on amphibious Shermans fitted with flotation screens and propellers. These swimming tanks would lead the assault on defended beaches. If the waterproofing failed, crews would drown before firing a shot. Above the invasion fleet, hundreds of bombers droned through storm clouds. Their bomb bays were loaded with explosives for the pre-invasion bombardment. Navigation in darkness and bad weather would test even experienced crews. The night sky filled with the sound of engines, transport planes carrying paratroopers. Bombers heading for German positions, fighter aircraft providing escort and cover. The air itself seemed to vibrate with mechanical thunder. On the French coast, German sentries huddled in bunkers and listened to the storm. Rain drummed against concrete walls. Wind howled through firing ports. The weather was too rough for any military operation. Even the most nervous defenders began to relax. Some German commanders had left their posts. Rommel himself was in Germany, visiting his wife on her birthday and planning to meet with Hitler. Many officers assumed the storm made invasion impossible for days. At 1:15 a.m. on June 6th, the first Allied soldiers struck inland behind the Atlantic Wall. British gliders swept silently through the darkness, wooden frames creaking as they descended toward French fields. They crash-landed near bridges over the Caen Canal, spilling out troops who immediately rushed to seize these vital crossings before German reinforcements could arrive. Paratroopers began dropping across Normandy, their silk canopies barely visible in the dark. Wind and clouds scattered formations. Some men landed in rivers and drowned, weighted down by equipment. Others crashed into stone buildings or tangled in power lines. Many found themselves alone in enemy territory, separated from their units, armed only with rifles and the determination to cause havoc behind German lines. They cut telephone wires, blocked roads, and attacked isolated positions. To the east and west of the invasion beaches, American airborne divisions dropped into chaos. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were scattered across miles of Norman countryside. Small groups of paratroopers stumbled through darkness, trying to find their objectives. Some landed directly in German positions and died before they could cut free of their parachutes. Others found themselves in flooded areas where Rommel had opened dikes to create obstacles. Weighted down with equipment, they struggled through deep water under enemy fire. But despite the chaos and confusion, the airborne assault achieved its purpose. By dawn, scattered groups of paratroopers held key roads, bridges, and towns. The noose around the invasion beaches was being tied from within. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment began. Allied warships opened fire with guns that lit the pre-dawn darkness like lightning. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed thousands of shells at German positions. The sound was beyond description. Thunder multiplied and sustained until the very air seemed to crack. Shells screamed overhead, their passage tearing the sky. They crashed into concrete bunkers, sending fountains of sand and debris into the air. Entire sections of the Atlantic Wall vanished in clouds of smoke and dust. German soldiers pressed themselves against bunker walls as their world shook apart. Dust rained from concrete ceilings. Equipment rattled off shelves. Radio communications failed as antennas were blown away. Some bunkers took direct hits from battleship guns. Shells weighing as much as automobiles punched through concrete walls and exploded inside. The men within had no chance of survival. Others survived the bombardment, but found themselves cut off from command and control. Telephone lines were severed. Radio sets were damaged. Many bunkers fought the coming battle in complete isolation. Then came the aircraft. Wave after wave of bombers roared over the coast, engines creating a sustained mechanical thunder. They dropped thousands of tons of high explosives on German positions. The morning sky was torn apart by explosions that could be seen for miles. Entire sections of the Atlantic Wall disappeared under clouds of smoke and flame. Gun positions that had taken months to build were obliterated in seconds. The concrete fortress began to crack and crumble under the weight of Allied firepower. At 6:30 a.m., the landing craft lowered their ramps. The invasion of Europe had begun. 5 beaches stretched along the Norman coast, each with its own story of triumph and tragedy. The Atlantic Wall, built to stop any invasion, was about to face the test that would determine its place in history. At Utah Beach, American forces caught a break that saved thousands of lives. Strong currents carried landing craft south of their intended target. Instead of hitting the most heavily defended section of beach, they came ashore in an area with lighter fortifications. The 4th Infantry Division waded through surf, under surprisingly light fire. German bunkers were there, but many had been damaged by the bombardment. Others were positioned to defend the original landing zone, not where the Americans actually came ashore. Within hours, Utah Beach was secure. Engineers cleared paths through minefields, while infantry pushed inland to link up with scattered paratroopers. By noon, a steady stream of supplies flowed across sand that had been soaked with blood at dawn. To the east, British forces stormed ashore at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. They faced more determined resistance, but specialized armor made the difference. Hobart's funnies proved their worth in breaking through beach defenses. Flail tanks whipped heavy chains ahead of them, detonating mines in spectacular explosions. AVRE vehicles fired huge charges that blew gaps in sea walls. Bridge-laying tanks carried their own steel spans, allowing following vehicles to cross obstacles quickly. D.D. Shermans, the swimming tanks, crawled out of the surf with water streaming from their flotation screens. German defenders watched in amazement as tanks appeared to rise from the sea itself, guns blazing at bunker positions. The Atlantic Wall was designed to stop conventional infantry assaults. It was not prepared for tanks that swam, for flails that cleared minefields, for bridges that appeared wherever they were needed. By evening, British and Canadian forces had pushed several miles inland. They captured villages, linked up with airborne units, and established supply dumps on beaches that had been killing grounds at dawn. But it was Omaha Beach that tested the Atlantic Wall most severely. The landing zone stretched for 6 miles between high bluffs. German positions dominated every inch of sand and surf. Bunkers were positioned for interlocking fields of fire. Artillery was pre-registered on every possible landing site. When American landing craft approached Omaha at 6:30 a.m., they sailed into hell. Machine guns opened fire from clifftop bunkers. Mortar rounds crashed into landing craft before they reached the beach. Artillery shells burst among men struggling through the surf. The water turned red with blood. Entire companies of infantry were cut down before they could organize. Amphibious tanks sank in rough seas, leaving their crews to drown in sealed compartments. Engineers trying to clear obstacles fell under concentrated fire. Bodies floated back out with each wave. Wounded men clung to steel obstacles, crying for help that could not reach them. Officers and NCOs died in the first minutes, leaving leaderless units pinned on open sand. For hours, the outcome hung in balance. German machine gunners poured fire into masses of men who could neither advance nor retreat. American forces seemed on the verge of complete destruction, but individual courage began to turn the tide. Small groups of soldiers found dead ground and began working their way up the bluffs. Engineers blasted gaps in barbed wire despite heavy casualties. Destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, their guns smashing bunkers at point-blank range. By afternoon, the heights above Omaha were in American hands. The cost was staggering, over 2,000 casualties in a single day. But the beach that had been called the slaughterhouse was finally secure. German command structure collapsed under the weight of simultaneous attacks across 50 miles of coast. Rommel was absent. Rundstedt was ignored. Hitler slept late and dismissed early reports as Allied deception. When panzer reserves finally received orders to counterattack, Allied fighter bombers were waiting. German tank columns were torn apart on French roads, their burning vehicles marking every attempt to reach the invasion beaches. By evening of June 6, 1944, over 150,000 Allied troops stood on French soil. The Atlantic Wall, designed to be impregnable, had been cracked wide open in less than 12 hours. The human cost was enormous. Allied casualties exceeded 10,000 men, with more than 4,000 confirmed dead. German losses remain uncertain, but thousands were killed, wounded, or captured in the defense of positions they could not hold. French civilians paid a price as well. Norman villages were destroyed by bombardment. Families fled burning homes with whatever possessions they could carry. The liberation of France began with the devastation of its ancient countryside. But in strategic terms, the result was unmistakable. Hitler's greatest fortress had failed its first and only test. Years of construction, millions of tons of concrete, and billions of Reichsmarks had been swept away in a single morning. The Atlantic Wall had promised to keep invaders out of Fortress Europe. Instead, it trapped defenders in bunkers that became their tombs. The static defense Hitler preferred had proven no match for Allied mobility, firepower, and technological innovation. News of the landings spread rapidly across the world. In Berlin, Nazi officials struggled to control panic while proclaiming that counterattacks would soon drive the Allies back into the sea. In London and Washington, church bells rang in celebration of Europe's liberation beginning. Across occupied nations, resistance fighters struck with renewed fury at German communications and supply lines. The psychological impact of breaching the Atlantic Wall was as important as the military victory itself. For the soldiers on both sides, June 6th marked only the beginning of a brutal campaign. The hedgerow country of Normandy would prove almost as difficult to break through as the coastal fortifications. Every field became a fortress. Every village required a separate battle. But the beachhead held and expanded day by day. Artificial harbors were towed across the channel and assembled off the invasion beaches. Pipelines pumped fuel under the water from England to France. By the end of June, over 500,000 Allied troops occupied Normandy. The Atlantic Wall had been Hitler's insurance policy against Western invasion. Its failure opened the door to Germany's ultimate defeat. Within 11 months, Allied and Soviet forces would meet in the ruins of Berlin. The fortress that was supposed to protect Nazi Europe for 1,000 years had crumbled in a single day. Today, remnants of the Atlantic Wall still dot Europe's western coastline. Concrete bunkers sit empty on French cliffs, their gun ports staring blindly at peaceful waters. Rusted steel reinforcement bars poke through crumbling walls like broken bones. Children play in positions where machine gunners once waited for targets that never came. Tourists photograph bunkers that were built to last forever, but now serve only as monuments to military miscalculation. The wall's failure in 1944 marked more than a tactical defeat. It represented the collapse of Hitler's entire strategic vision for defending Europe. The Führer had believed that concrete and steel could substitute for mobility and flexible defense. His generals had argued for keeping armored reserves inland, ready to counterattack once the enemy's intentions became clear. Instead, Hitler divided his forces between static coastal defense and reserves he refused to release in time to make a difference. The Atlantic Wall became a symbol of authoritarian thinking that confused impressive appearance with military effectiveness. Propaganda films showed massive bunkers and huge guns, but they could not show the poor coordination between positions or the inadequate training of gun crews. For military historians, the wall's defeat validated new principles of warfare that would dominate strategy for decades to come. Air power had proven decisive in isolating the battlefield and preventing effective counterattack. Specialized equipment could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Amphibious operations could succeed against heavily fortified coasts if properly planned and executed. The lessons extended beyond military affairs. The Atlantic Wall demonstrated how totalitarian regimes could waste enormous resources on projects that looked impressive, but served no practical purpose. Millions of tons of concrete had been poured into a line that was broken in its first serious test. Modern military doctrine learned to emphasize mobility over fortification, flexibility over rigidity, and coordination over impressive but isolated strongpoints. No army since 1944 has placed primary faith in fixed defenses against a determined enemy with control of the air. The wall also became a symbol of liberation for the peoples of occupied Europe. Its breach represented the beginning of the end for Nazi tyranny. French, Belgian, Dutch, and Norwegian civilians who had suffered years of occupation could finally see hope of freedom. Veterans of both sides have returned to Normandy in the decades since the invasion. German survivors often express respect for Allied courage and planning. Allied veterans remember fallen comrades and the terrible cost of breaking the fortress. The beaches themselves tell the story. Omaha Beach, once soaked with blood, now hosts peaceful families on summer vacations. Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches see sailing boats where landing craft once struggled through deadly surf. Utah Beach remains quiet, its gentle waters giving no hint of the violence that once erupted there. Museums preserve artifacts from both sides. German weapons sit beside Allied equipment. Personal letters describe fears and hopes that proved universal despite the uniforms worn by their authors. The human dimension of the battle emerges from displays of helmets, photographs, and final messages, home. Perhaps the Atlantic Wall's greatest legacy is its reminder that no defense is permanent. Technology advances. Tactics evolve. The fortress that seems impregnable today may prove vulnerable tomorrow. History flows like the tides that wash against Normandy's beaches. Concrete walls can delay that flow, but they cannot stop it permanently. The Atlantic Wall stood for 3 years and fell in one day, but its ruins remain as testimony to human courage, sacrifice, and the ultimate futility of trying to build permanent barriers against the forces of change. The gray waters of the English Channel still roll against the Norman shore. The tides rise and fall as they have for millennia, but the concrete scars on the landscape serve as permanent reminders of one morning in June when the fate of the world hung in balance between Hitler's fortress and Allied determination. The wall that was meant to last forever lasted just long enough to learn that nothing in war and nothing in history is ever truly permanent.